Indonesia has been trying to move up the value chain for the country. It's a big step, and as well for the region in Southeast Asia.
One of the hallmarks of this Indonesia project is mines to megapacks.
Think about how it can get into the broader regional supply chain that's developing.
For the global south, this could be a template.
So there are some serious environmental concerns, and I think the more that those can be addressed, of course, it shifts the balance in favor of this being a leap forward in environmental protection and clean energy.
I think the next question will actually be what's going to happen within the region broadly.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
From nickel-rich rainforests to battery plants on the rise, Indonesia is teaming up with China to chase the EV prize. Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyen. Joining me to explore how Indonesia-China EV battery collaboration could power Asia's green future. Andy Mock, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Kevin Nauen, a senior research fellow at the Asian Vision Institute. And Putra Adhiguna, the managing director of the Indonesia-based nonprofit think tank Energy Shift Institute. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. So let's start with the basics. A lithium-ion battery plant is now under construction in West Java, Indonesia, part of a $6 billion joint project between Indonesia Battery Corporation and the world's largest EV battery maker, China's CATL. It's expected to go operational by the end of next year with an initial capacity of nearly 7 gigawatt hours, expanding to 15 gigawatt hours in the future. So, Putra, I understand President Prabowo has called this project colossal and an extraordinary breakthrough. So, what does that mean? What does this scale of production actually mean in global terms?
Yeah, hi to you, and good to chat with everybody here. Thanks for having me. I think this is an important step for Indonesia as a country because Indonesia is home to roughly 60 to 70% of the global nickel supply chain. And the commodity is a big part of the battery sectors, or at least it was in the last 5 to 10 years. So this battery factory means a lot because it means that Indonesia has been trying to move up the value chain from basically a raw material exporter, and now it wants to be within the higher value chain option. So having an additional battery capacity is important. Now, in terms of global capacity of manufacturing, it's not really that significant, frankly speaking, because right now there's about 3,000 gigawatt hour of manufacturing capacity, and it'll go only roughly about 5 to 10. It's not that significant, but again, for the country, it's a big step, and as well for the region in Southeast Asia.
So basically, it's like a medium-sized plant?
It's a reasonably sized plant. So I think all of the crucial battery factories right now is within the scale of gigawatt hours. The plan that is being outlined is somewhere between 6 to 15 gigawatt hour capacity. So it's quite a reasonably sized plant globally.
And Andy, on the Chinese side, why do you think CATL chose West Java for such a major investment?
Well, Tuyun, I think for several reasons. So first of all, CATL is a global leader in terms of market share when it comes to batteries. It is also a technology leader and a pioneer. So a remarkably successful company recently had an IPO in Hong Kong during May. I was actually on the floor of the stock exchange for the IPO. But it's a company with global ambitions. So first, why Indonesia? So as we heard a little bit from Putra about Indonesia, but it is the fourth largest country in the world in terms of population, rapidly growing. And I think like some countries say in the Middle East, like the UAE, strong visionary leadership. And I think the government of Indonesia recognizes the importance of electric vehicles, and also sustainability, or I would say transportation, building transportation capacity, not only for the people of Indonesia, but maybe ASEAN and the world as well, and environmental sustainability. So I think from CATL's perspective, then they would see Indonesia, again, enormous potential market, a competent government with a complementary vision, which makes that very important. Now, then, why West Java? So, West Java, I think some think of as the Detroit of Indonesia. So, there are other global car manufacturers there. And one point I want to add, I think we'll talk about more. There's also this overlap in that CATL sees sustainability, in particular, this so-called circular economy, as an important part of its corporate strategy. So, for example, it recently announced a partnership with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation at Climate Week, which I think is just wrapping up this week, to ensure that their long-term goal is at least 50% of their batteries are not from virgin materials, so meaning recycling batteries. And again, one of the, I think, the hallmarks of this Indonesia project is mines to mega packs, if we want to call it that, meaning, providing everything from taking the ore out of the ground, processing it, turning it into commercial products, but also going beyond that and making sure that these don't go from, I think, what the MacArthur Foundation calls the traditional model of take, make, waste, meaning manufacturers take things out of the ground, they make things with them, and when people are done with them, they throw them away into a trash heap. But that, in fact, that this is meant to also build recycling into the circular economy of batteries. And again, I think this is one of the key reasons CATL has chosen Indonesia for this very important project.
Then to Kevin, I understand you're now living in Cambodia, a regional neighbor of Indonesia. So from your perspective, amid intensifying global competition over, clean tech and EV supply chains, how is this battery project being perceived regionally or internationally, and maybe from a Cambodian perspective in particular?
Well, I think there's three levels to look at it. The first is the Cambodian perspective, which you mentioned, and the second is the ASEAN perspective, the regional perspective. And of course, the third is more the perspective from the West, which is obviously, or not surprisingly, going to be a little bit more concerned and critical, maybe pointing out potential downsides of the deal. But from the Cambodian perspective, it's viewed quite positively. Cambodia has a substantial history over the past 20 years or more of increasing partnership with China. And Chinese private sector development is the number one investment source in Cambodia. And Cambodia also looks positively on large projects, Belt Road Initiative, and so on. So I think Cambodia sees this very positively, and Cambodia has its own national policies for both automotive manufacturing and also for EV production and lithium battery production more specifically. So Cambodia does not have the natural resource endowments that Indonesia has. And so, of course, a big reason, as was mentioned, China is and CATL is looking into Indonesia. Also, other companies like Wayu mining in Indonesia is because of the nickel supply. So Cambodia doesn't have that natural resource endowments. What Cambodia has is political stability and low-cost labor, which could allow Cambodia to kind of get into the supply chain in terms of manufacturing, maybe assembly of battery packs or another stage in EV production. BYD has announced plans to increase production in Cambodia and up to 10,000 units per year, which is the goal they've set. So other Western companies as well have increased automotive manufacturing in Cambodia, and Japanese companies also, such as Toyota. So I think from the Cambodian perspective, it's viewed quite positively, and I think Cambodia is going to try to learn from this and think about how it can get into the broader regional supply chain that's developing.
So it wouldn't see it like regional rival. Rather, it's more like partner, maybe.
Well, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say partner as of yet. They view it positively. I think they see it as an opportunity for partnerships, but certainly no, not as a rival. Just because, again, none of the upstream elements are there. There is no real substantial nickel supplies in Cambodia. And in terms of manufacturing, the downstream element, I think they would want to get linked into broader supply chains that are connected to large Chinese companies such as CATL, so they can better access the Chinese market through that.
Right. And we've already actually touched upon the significance of this project to Indonesia or to China. But more specifically, Putra, in the short term, what benefits is Indonesia actually expecting from this deal, like more jobs or exports, infrastructure, environment, or anything else? Can you be more specific about it?
Yeah, and I think both Andy and Kevin highlighted a very important points about, regional partnerships as well as, being in a circular value chain, right? So if we pull back a little bit, the world is in an intersection, right? The growth of the electric vehicles is very clear. We're seeing the demand continue to rise. And therefore, I think for many countries, it is a very clear intersection for them to decide whether they're going to take the fast lane or they're going to take the slow lane in the business as usual. Now, for countries like Indonesia, I do not think that we're actually speaking about near-term goals
All
because I
right.
think this is a very strategic move, both for the near term as well as the longer term, because Southeast Asia as a whole is a big oil importer region, and Indonesia actually imported quite a big deal of its oil. So moving into electric vehicles is the way to go moving forward, and having an electric vehicle manufacturing capability supported by the batteries is very important. So there's going to be some jobs that's created, but I think it's really the signal that is being sent is that the Chinese investment will be able to help certain countries to move up the value chain. Now, the degree toward that moving up the ladder will still be an open question. So obviously today there's a lot of investment happening globally. A lot of people are talking about overcapacity in batteries and so forth. So I think there's still going to be a push and pull dynamics happening for the next few years. So a lot of jobs will be created, but I think the most important part is actually it sent a new signal of development globally. Whether some agree or not agree, a lot of people are seeing Indonesia as an exemplary case of how an ore exporting country can move up the value chain, right? Many countries within Asia as well as in Africa are looking up to Indonesia because they are within that same intersection. They want to move up the economies and they want to figure out how they can participate in a wider value chain. Again, it's a complex story because at the end of the day, no one countries can ever have the full leverage to dominate many things, right? I mean, just because you have a nickel or just because you have a cobalt doesn't mean you will have the entire value chain in your country. So
Right.
picking up on what Kevin just mentioned, a regional partnership will definitely be an important part as well as the story moving forward. Let me stop there.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Yes, so like you said, it set a good example for others, especially those maybe in Africa, to follow in the future. But from the Chinese perspective, Andy, you've talked about how this means to the company, CATL, but to a broader prospect, does it reflect the country's broader strategy to secure, upstream battery supply chains in Southeast Asia, or is there any more, meaning to it?
Well, I think there's certainly tangible economic benefits for China and obviously for CATL from this project. But let me maybe focus, if I may, on a little bit more of the intangibles, or maybe we could even call it the soft power
All right.
aspect of this. So, one part of this is there will be a recycling line as part of this project. And to go back to what happened at London Climate Action Week, So with this announcement, the vision is that within 20 years, at least half the metals in every new CAT battery be recycled rather than mined. So right there, obviously, especially with younger people around the world, very, very sensitive, very, very alert to this kind of corporate responsibility, I suppose we could call it. But here's another interesting part of this, right? Is that the recycling of the globe is expected to reach about 160 billion US dollars by 2040 and support more than 10 million jobs globally, with half in developing economies.
Mm.
So again, we can see CATL as a Chinese company, but also a pioneer in, kind of the technology, the chemistry, as well as the manufacturing, taking a leadership role here. And I think that this, we should not underestimate the soft power impact of this. And I imagine we'll be hearing more about this in the years to come.
Then, Kevin, from your perspective, some people actually characterize it as a leap forward in clean energy, but others say it probably is a high voltage gamble. How would you define it?
Between the two choices, I would go with the leap forward. I think Andy makes a very good point about the recycling. CATL has been
Indeed.
playing a leading role in developing recycling methods, and end of battery life waste is a huge environmental concern from this type of production. So, if the end of battery life waste can be better addressed, and I think Andy touched on this a little bit, but also not just simply in terms of soft power, but in a way that is economically viable or even economically profitable, then of course there's a global public good benefit to what's happening. I would point out, though, that I think, there are still some environmental concerns related to what's going on, especially in the upstream element of Halmahera, which is the larger part of the investment in monetary terms, related to the use of coal for the smelting, and then potential wastewater management problems, which could be addressed with sufficient good governance. And of course, the deforestation that results from open pit mining, which is the general practice for mining nickel in Indonesia. So there are some serious environmental concerns, and I think the more that those can be addressed, of course, it shifts the balance in favor of this being a leap forward in environmental protection and clean energy.
Yeah, like many other large-scale industrial projects, environmental groups also raised concerns about this one. So, Putra, can you tell us how has the Indonesian government responded to such criticisms?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to set the nickel production in context first, right? Roughly two-thirds of the nickel that is produced in Indonesia today doesn't actually end up in electric vehicles. So what it tends to happen is that most of them ends up in the stainless steel, which is a traditional industry. But then we have this overly polarized debates that EV destroys the nature. So there's a lot of validity to that statement, but there's also a lot of nuances on where those nickel actually ends up in, because then you have people who's literally saying, I don't like EV because it's destroying the environment, when the reality may be two-thirds of those nickel never ends up in electric vehicles. So the government has been responding in different ways, although what is worrying is that it seems that many people seems to be more reliant on what the private sector can do rather than the government enforcement. To put it mildly, this is, I guess, another case of the difficulties of balancing the trade-off between developments and, progress, and then the social and environmental impacts, right? When Indonesia entered the nickel market, I'd like to call it that Indonesia opened a floodgate, right? It opened a floodgate, it crashed the nickel market because it supplies so many nickel to the global market. At the same time, it also crashed the ESG standards globally. Is it fixable? I would like to believe that it is actually fixable, but it really needs a strong governance coming from the government. That's one. But secondly, as well, we also need a strong commitment from the private sectors. And I think earlier the discussions about CATL commitment shows the progress is moving to the right directions because the leverage of moving towards a greener development seems to be stronger in more visible companies, right? Visible value chains such as the electric vehicles, I think is more sensitive to pressures about social and environmental as compared to something that is more traditional, like the stainless steel. So there's an opportunity here, and it's good to see that companies like CATL is actually putting their step forwards. I mean, traditionally, I think a lot of people seem to think that European companies may be more greener and so forth. So it's very welcome to see that the signal is out there, and now we really need to see how it's actually going to transpire on the ground. Because the reality, let me close with this, is that everybody want to talk about a green value chain. Everybody want to talk about the green nickel. The reality is that not many are willing to pay a bit of a premium to get those, products. So I think we're seeing multiple dynamics in play, and it will be an interesting space to watch. One other thing is that in China, as we know, 3/4 of electric vehicle sales doesn't use nickel anymore. So the land is actually, the tectonic plate of the nickel sector is actually shifting as we speak. So Indonesia has opened the floodgate. Now, at the same time, technology is moving forward, both in terms of circularity as well as in terms of moving to other kinds of battery technologies.
When you say Indonesia crashed the ESG standard, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so before Indonesia flooded the global nickel market, there's many producers of nickel, right? Anywhere from Canada, Australia, and so forth. Each of these have vastly different colors about the level of environmental, social, and governance that they're implementing. Now, when Indonesia opened up its downstreaming sector, basically inviting all the investors to come in and build all the smelters domestically with all kinds of tax break and so forth, it basically untapped a whole new resource that is, let's call it very low cost, right? So as you open up this very low cost, you're basically making everybody else uncompetitive to compare to Indonesia's nickel. And this is where the trouble comes, right? Some Canadian nickel producer may say, hey, we got a greener nickel, right? But who are willing to pay a bit of a premium as compared to us? So I think that's the dynamics that is at play here, is
Right.
that Indonesia is producing nickel at such a cheap cost and at a very vast scale that many others in other countries is finding it difficult to compete with.
Kevin, do you find your Indonesian colleagues' explanation here convincing, or?
Yeah, for the most part, I agree with what's been said. I think this particular project, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to build best practices, and the lessons learned can be replicated by other developing states, whether they're dependent on natural resource endowments or dependent on low-cost labor, as in the Cambodian case.
Right. And Andy, I'm not sure if you know anything about the Chinese company CATL, whether it's bringing its experiences or what kind of experiences it is bringing or lessons learned to Indonesia or to this project in West Java.
I would say generally, yes, of course, because, if we think about CATL, in some sense, it's a relatively young company, but, really has accumulated a lot of experience within China, and of course is going global with investments, not just in Indonesia, but Europe, other parts of the world as well. So I think certainly, there are lessons learned, but at the same time, every market, every country is different. So I think it's striking the balance there. And, whether, CATL can reach the level of global success like a Huawei, right? That, has gone global and really adapted to a lot of local markets. I want to go back, though, to what I think Putra was saying about the nickel market in Indonesia. But, one way we could look at that is it's actually a good thing, isn't it? I mean, that, if we look at it from a market perspective, nickel is such an important input, not just for batteries, but stainless steel, like he said, but also alloys used in aerospace, military applications, etc. So, quote unquote, crashing the market, or meaning, flooding the market with much a greater supply that lowers the prices. Of course, existing suppliers, may suffer. But overall, I see that as maybe a good thing, right? Because then that means that many manufacturers have lower input costs. It might create the incentives to innovate with nickel to use it for more things. I mean, this is generally what we see with other inputs, right? Whether that's computing, whether that's other physical resources, that when they become cheap enough, it really unlocks, new sources. Now, of course, we also have to consider the environmental impact as well. But I just wanted to maybe add a little bit of another perspective of the glass being half full,
Right.
perhaps, on lower nickel prices.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Check out the biggest challenges the Sino-Indonesian joint project may face down the road when we come back. Stay with us.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our discussion on Indonesia-China EV battery collaboration. There are still some other concerns, one of which being Indonesia's dependence on Chinese technology and capital in its green transition. So, Putra, how concerning does that sound to you?
To me, it's not concerning at all, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of, I can't remember whether Andy or Kevin highlighted earlier, there's a lot of, let's call it the Western view, the West versus the Eastern view. There's a lot of critics about what's happening. China being the natural front runners in many clean technology today, it's natural for them to be engaged with many different parties, right? Whether it's Cambodia, Malaysia, India, or even Indonesia. So I think it's just a natural part of the value chain, and I think it's an open competition for everyone. Countries like Indonesia is also open to many investors, right? There's investors coming from Europe and whatnot, and really it's about which one can give the best value for their investments, and I think it's a reciprocal relationship. So to me, I'm not too worried. Having a diversification strategy will be important, but not just for technology, but also to raise the bar in terms of environmental and social standards. And I do have to say, like Andy's point, I do agree, right? There's a lot of positive sides of flooding the market with cheap nickel. I think my reservation is really we're flooding the market with cheap nickel with compromised social environmental standards. Really, that's really the underline of my statement, is that if we can get it better, maybe, at a 10 to 20% premium, I think we're going to meet a very good intersection between development as well as the energy transitions.
And on the Chinese side, I'm not saying it's a concern of the CATL or the majority, but some people are worried that this could lead to industrial chain relocation, because this project spans the entire battery production chain from laterite nickel extraction and hydrometallurgy to battery manufacturing and recycling, like you all mentioned. There could also be, technology transfer risks or even loss of orders for the Chinese side. So, Andy, how serious do you think those concerns are in this context?
Well, I think what's going to be clear, Yoon, is that they're going to be increasingly important issues as time goes on, because we can see clearly China's moving up the technology value chain. CATL, as I mentioned, is not just a global leader in terms of market share, but also technology leadership as well. And, I think it very clearly sees one of its strategic assets is its technology and its capability to innovate. So, like any good corporate executive, I think the leadership team, must be concerned about that. We look at it in AI with DeepSeek, although it's open source, but, there's still, I think, areas of technology that they would want to maintain some sort of proprietary ownership of Huawei, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. So, I think it is increasingly an important topic, and nationally as well. So we know that technology and manufacturing capacity is an important plank in national security. So clearly, I think every country has these concerns, and China, as it becomes increasingly a global technology leader, is, of course, paying more attention to these kinds of concerns. And the question, of course, is what is the appropriate balance to strike, right? And, that's always, I think, really has to depend on the specifics of any particular situation. As Americans love to say, the devil's in the details.
Indeed. Kevin, I understand you seem to always look at things from a positive side. So what's your interpretation here?
Well, yes, I try to stay optimistic in general in life, and on this topic as well. I did try to point out what I think are some of the environmental concerns. I think, a lot of those concerns can be mitigated through good governance.
Right.
Putra mentioned enforcement, but he also emphasized corporate level best practices. I think really though the results are going to depend on Indonesian government practices and what they put in place, right? So they're taking a pragmatic approach where they're trying to balance, energy sovereignty, energy security, also value-added industrialization with environmental protection. That balance can be done if the right enforcement of violations is in place. So, but that's going to depend on them, really. I mean, Indonesia is a sovereign state, and so the burden is not on necessarily the international company coming in to do that. In terms of the risks for Indonesia, the risk, reliance on the Chinese market and potential downturn, a skills gap between Indonesian workers and Chinese labor, limited ability to diversify. So as Putra mentioned, there needs to be a diversification plan in place. And I have seen some literature which emphasizes the compulsion for security alignment on the part of Indonesia resulting from economic dependence on China. But I'm not particularly swayed by those criticisms. So, because a lot of those are to some extent unavoidable risks, market downturns are risks that people have to take. And I think so the success of the project for Indonesia will depend on effective tech transfer and skill transfer. Now, does that mean that China is going to expand its technological ecosystem? Yes, it does. I think that's undeniable. But I also think that would come with any country investing. And as Andy mentioned, China is the leader in green technology, and especially in this area of EV and EV batteries. So, of course, it's not surprising that someone who's at the cutting edge and is leading in an area of technology is going to successfully expand the reach of their technological ecosystem. I think some of the criticisms, the problem is they're not looking at it, these Western criticisms are not looking at it in terms of what's best for Indonesia, right? They're looking at it for how does it affect them in the West? And that's just not going to convince anyone in Indonesia. We had the same experience here in Cambodia with Huawei and 5G. And when 5G was adopted here in Cambodia, there was a lot of criticism from the West. And I remember speaking to a member of Cambodian parliament, and he said to me simply like, look, no one else is offering us 5G. What are we supposed to do? Like that, the criticisms are falling on deaf ears because, national level authorities are thinking about their own national best interests.
Indeed. You've talked about the flooding of nickel. Maybe it's already settled here. But another concern is about the flooding or overcapacity of EV batteries. A mismatch between capacity and evolving demand or technology could indeed create excess capacity, especially in emerging markets like Indonesia, where uptake is sometimes uncertain. So some caution, it may lead to like wasted investment, stranded assets, or even political backlash. So, Kevin, do you see it that way too, or?
There's certainly some potential for that. And again, I think it depends on, to some extent, I don't think the public outcry is going to be over these more abstract issues of dependency and limited ability to diversify. I think there will be more based on how the project affects the livelihood of the people in West Java. And so it will depend on the extent of deforestation, wastewater pollution, whether or not toxic heavy metals are making it into the water supply, because these are the things that will affect the livelihood of the population in that area.
And Putra, how would you respond to such concerns or questions?
I think the talks about overcapacity, it's really depending who talks about it, right? I mean, a lot of people are complaining about the overcapacity coming from the global battery because China is dominating the sector. But coming back to what Andy's highlighted, flooding the world with cheap battery is not necessarily bad, right? I mean, people can get the electric vehicle adoptions moving so fast. Sure, there will be a lot of the usual market dynamics, market consolidation. Some companies will survive, other may not. But I think it's just part and parcel of having any kinds of industrial development. It's a big race, right? Everybody want to be on first. Some will survive, others may not be. And I think it's not unique to the battery sector. So now one point, however, relating to Indonesia, I think an interesting statement is that there may be some state involvement within some of these value chain, right? Danantara, one of Indonesia's quasi-sovereign wealth fund, is potentially going to invest a little bit. So I think they just need to be fully aware that the market as it is, it'll be highly competitive because sometimes as you inject some state funds, people tend to make a bit of a noise later on, right? So I think it's really about make it a prudent investment. But the world is on a competitive race, right? Be ready to fight with good strategy and fight competitively.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
So overall, you three are very positive about this project, but there are some challenges going forward. So let's talk about its challenges. What are the biggest challenges you foresee in keeping this project on track? We've seen, South Korea's LG Energy Solution pull out of Indonesia's high-profile Project Titan due to shifting market conditions. That's what they say. Putra, could similar uncertainties, be it economic or geopolitical, emerge here as well?
I think it's that thing is always on the table, right? I mean, again, coming back to the global market dynamics, a lot of capacity on battery manufacturing. I think we will see a lot of scaling back of ambitions, right? I mean, last year there's at least about 300 gigawatt hour of announced battery manufacturing that was postponed or canceled. That's a lot of capacity. But what it also tells us is that there's a lot of adjustment, right? CATL actually scaled back their initial investment plans that they announced several years ago. So I think there's a lot of a rationalizing process, and I think it's a good step. People are trying to figure out what's happening in the market, and they, tone it down a little bit. I guess the risk is really not that money, right? I mean, if they can build a factory on the ground, it'll probably going to be one of the most important factories in Indonesia and probably within the region as well. I think the next question will actually be what's going to happen within the region broadly, looking at the neighbors, the Vietnam, the Malaysia, the Thailand and whatnot, because everybody also want to build their own battery manufacturing capacity.
Indeed.
So I think it'll be interesting to watch what's going to happen within the next few years and all the announcement that is taking place. Coming back to the risk that I highlighted earlier, the state involvement does present a bit of a risk for the Indonesian fiscal side. But other than that, as long as the standards can be maintained high enough, and if we're hearing that CATL is progressive enough in their standards, I think it's a good step in the right direction.
So which one would you say is the biggest one, the state thing?
I think it's really just when state-owned enterprise or state budget enters an investment, right? They need to be ready to take the hit if they do lose money. And I think that part is where in places like Indonesia can become a very politically sensitive subject. It's kind of like you're throwing money down the drain. So I think it's really making sure that everybody approach this topic with a clear-eyed view of what the market looks like today. Like overall, it's all good in terms of the plan for, moving up the value chains, creating jobs, technology transfer, and so forth. But I think it's important for Indonesia, both the government as well as the sovereign wealth fund, to enter this with a cleared eye assessment that this is a competitive landscape. So I think that's actually quite a bigger risk in terms of politics, right? I think that the politics side will be interesting.
Right, Andy. So I think CATL should have taken into account Indonesia's domestic politics, right? When they made this decision to make investment there. What would you say might be the biggest challenges for this project going forward?
Well, so if we step back, right, and just take a look at so the battery market, there's really two main markets. So there's mobility, right, for transportation, cars, trucks, scooters, whatever. And then there's storage solutions for stationary. But if we look at kind of this issue, right, first there's the economic impact of overcapacity. And I think here, if we look at what's going on in China today, some powerful and painful lessons of what's called involution, right? Where, you have a number of these companies in the electric vehicle space. So the BYDs, the NIOs, the XPengs, the Teslas, in the Chinese market, all competing ferociously, driving prices down, overcapacity. And, on the one hand, the central government sees this as an issue that needs to be managed. But at the same time, to go back to maybe it was Kevin's point, right, about the role of the state. So here in China, of course, we have this countervailing political force of, why does this continue? So one, of course, is local governments, whether we're talking municipal or maybe provincial governments, want their champion to be the winner and, maybe keep supporting an EV in the hopes that it will be one of the last companies standing.
Indeed.
So, whether this issue plays out in other parts of the world as well, I think clearly is something that every company in every part of the value chain, whether you're in the vehicle space, the battery space, or maybe even upstream of this, you need to pay attention to. And sometimes companies can get caught up, right, in these dynamics. So this is something, we have to see. To use a Michael Porter five forces analysis on this, if the barriers to exit are really high for whatever reasons and companies don't leave, you might be stuck in this position of overcapacity for a while. And then the other question, I think we can ask is, is this a temporary situation? So any new industry, any new market typically goes through, an innovation phase. And then suddenly, like mushrooms after a rain, you have all these new companies starting, and then there's a weeding out process, and you reach some sort of market equilibrium, whether that might be one company or an oligopoly or, some more like a restaurant market in a big city, right? People, there's many, many of them. They come and go because the barriers to entry are relatively low. The barriers to exit are relatively low. Now, certainly it seems like the battery industry, because it is relatively capital intensive, there are high barriers to entry, permitting, all of these other things. We have to see how will this play out. But, given I think CATL's track record, again, very non-trivial to build a globally technology leading battery company, is not just technical expertise, but also I think management, vision, perseverance, all of these other intangibles. And we know from business in China that growing in China is not necessarily so easy as well, right? So if you're in Fujian and you want to expand globally, that's not always the easiest thing either. So I think we have to see, but I think CATL definitely a tested management team. So let's see what happens in the long run.
So for the moment, you don't see any serious challenges emerging?
Well, I mean, I would put it this way, Yun. I mean, there are, of course, daunting challenges, right? So Indonesia is a big country. It's a complex country. It's developing. It's a foreign market for CATL. So, there's lots of challenges, lots of things that can go wrong. This is
The biggest one?
uh, well, we have to see, right? I mean, I would say it really depends. If we only look at Indonesia, I would say, again, being completely outside of this, it would be adapting to the local realities, making sure you have good relations with local government, the central government, dealing with any potential stakeholder issues, whether that's environmental, labor concerns, etc. These are the things that typically derail foreign investments, right? But then, we have to think about globally as well. What if demand for electric vehicles falls off a cliff for some unexpected reason? So again, lots and lots of challenges. It's easy as armchair quarterbacks, right, to say, "Oh, this is an amazing opportunity," which it is. But at the same time, the actual doing of it is incredibly, incredibly challenging. And again, I would look at it from an investor perspective, which is again, which makes it on the one hand, exciting, but also very challenging. If we look at, say, the EV space, who's going to be one of the companies left standing? Who are going to be the big economic winners, right? And who's going to be roadkill, right? Or a casualty of this incredibly competitive phase that we're in.
All right. And Kevin, do you see any imminent challenge rising or in front of you?
I would just echo, I think, a lot of what Andy said about, the local realities and dealing with local government for foreign investment and maintaining good relations. There's 18 related infrastructure projects. So it's a very complex overall project, and it's the challenges are built into it. But I think in terms of the overcapacity globally, the project is in its beginning stages, so there's ample opportunity with the right management, as Andy emphasized, to adapt and evolve in the process of implementation, to not sort of over leverage and, to take that reality and keep it in mind, as Putra emphasized. So I think that that's the best approach. When it comes to CATL, this is a move in order to make the company dominant in nickel, lithium ion nickel manganese batteries, with high energy densities, which are important for EVs, especially for more long distance travel. And certainly a lot of the EVs, which are consumed in the West at this time, are using that. So it's a risk for CATL, but it's, I think, a risk worth it in that it pays off through dominance over the market because they already have such a control or an important portion of the LFP part of the market, right? So this for them is a way to kind of, expand them globally and really make CATL dominant across battery types. So I think it's a risk. There's some risk there, but I think it's a risk worth taking. And I do think the issue of oversupply is an important one, but I think in the long term, it will not be such a big factor.
All right. And finally, a question to you all. In the long run, how might this battery hub reshape Indonesia's role in the regional and possibly global EV supply chain, if it can? Maybe we start with Andy?
Well, I think that, there's a lot to be excited about here, right? So, again, Indonesia, fourth largest population in the world, but still with a lot of economic upside, right? What about a 1.5 trillion US dollar economy, like what, $5,000-ish per capita GDP. So a lot of upside here. And it's, so-called industry of the future. It's environmentally sustainable. Most would say that we are moving towards a world of NEV. So I think that's very good. And again, if Indonesia does well as a cornerstone of ASEAN, which is, increasingly the economic center of gravity for the entire world, this is a positive. for the global south, again, this could be a template. We talked a little bit about other mineral resource rich countries that could pursue this approach of not just being a commodity exporter, but how do you move up the value chain, as Indonesia has done, to say, look, you can't just take our nickel. You have to come here and, do things with it. So, I think, again, there's a lot to be excited about at a more strategic level. But again, as having been an investor in this part of the world, these are incredibly difficult things to do operationally. There's operational risk, there's political risk, there's market risk. But when we look at the record of CATL, visionary team led by Robin Zeng, who talks about these really exciting things like going from parts per million, meaning, one fault in every million procedures or battery cells to parts per billion, right? And this is incredibly important if you want to go to these large scale storage batteries, because they have millions and millions of cells. They're not, small, they're, enormous structures. So if you have one failure per million, that means you're probably dealing with failures every day. So there's a lot of exciting things here. So I think this is probably why we're also talking about this, that it's important for Indonesia, important for ASEAN, important for the world, and I think shows some really exciting things that CATL is doing.
And Kevin, is it really that powerful that could be a key piece in powering Asia's green future?
Yeah, I think so. But again, it's a unique case because of Indonesia's nickel supply, right? It really puts it in a unique position. So to the extent that other countries could sort of drive this value-added industrialization by cutting off exports of an essential commodity, if that is the requirement of doing it, then it's not going to be easily copied elsewhere. One case comes to mind is maybe cobalt in DRC, but that's not going to happen because of, governance issues in the DRC. So as is, can it be copy pasted? No, but certainly, again, key lessons can be learned. And I think the overall ethos of the approach of, hilirisasi, the Indonesian policy, I think is important for other countries to think about how they can implement it in their own way.
All right, last but not least, the Putra, please.
Yeah, I think talking about China and the world, having CATL on the ground in countries like Indonesia is actually bring a very big potential for an exemplary case, right? CATL is one of the leading companies based out of China. There's a lot of commitments for them to progress both technologically as well as all kinds of, environmental and social standards. And I think having them closer to the ground, closer to the value chain, will be able to push the cart in the right directions. I agree with what has been discussed here is that it may not be completely replicable in many other contexts, but I think it will present a good example of how China cooperate with other countries, and while at the same time bringing their leading companies to actually push the cart in the right directions, both in terms of progressing in investment, as well as hopefully raising the bar on the ESG development as well.
On that note, we've come to the end of our chat for this session. Many thanks to Putra Adhiguna, the Managing Director of the Indonesia-based Energy Shift Institute, Kevin Nauen, a Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Vision Institute, and Andy Mogg, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, for sharing your insightful views with us. The show is available on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyin. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week for more chat at the Chat Lounge. Bye.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between 2 vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Yong Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.